All right. I think we still have a few people who are trickling in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Wanted to just quickly introduce myself. My name is Earl Lang. I'm the Senior Integrated Marketing Manager here at Dude Solutions, and I will be moderating today's webcast on a public sector guide to energy management. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us, taking time out of your day to listen in to our experts on energy management in the public sector. I'm going to go over some quick housekeeping items really quick before I introduce our distinguished speakers, just so you guys have an idea of kind of how the event is set up and structured for today. Phone lines have been muted. That is mostly just to reduce the amount of potential background noise from those who are listening in. We don't want that to discourage participation from all of you, though. So there is a Q&A feature in the Zoom platform, the webinar tool that we're all using today. If you have questions throughout the event, please do submit those. We'll be monitoring those in the background. If you have questions for our speakers along the way, we do have a Q&A and some time set aside at the end to address those. Or if you're having technical issues as well, feel free to bring those and we'll try to walk you through and find a solution the best we can. So without further ado, I've done my job here on the front end. I'm going to go ahead and briefly introduce our speakers. Dan Arant is a Senior Solutions Consultant here with us at Dude Solutions. Spends a lot of time with clients talking about energy. He's going to lead us through the bulk of the presentation and is joined by Mark Clinch. Mark is the Director of Facilities and Energy Management for the town of Normal. Been with the town since April of 2012. Prior to joining the team at the town of Normal, worked his way through the ranks at Ottawa Township High School in Ottawa, Illinois. He's got 15 years serving at Ottawa High School, 11 where he spent as the Director of Operations and Maintenance. Earned an associate's degree in construction tech and bachelor's degree in advanced tech studies from Southern Illinois University, and then later went on to complete his master's degree at Northern Illinois. He holds an additional professional credentials, including Certified Facility Manager and Sustainable Facility Professional, which were accredited both by the International Facility Managers Association. Mark is a USGBC LEED Green Associate and a licensed electrician in both Ottawa and Normal, Illinois. So without further ado, Dan, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you guys to take over for the bulk of today's presentation.
Awesome. Very good. Very good. Thanks, Earl. Mark, thanks for joining us. I specifically thought about you when we put this together, Public Sector's Guide, and we talked a little bit about this, kind of kicking things off. But in addition to how long you've been with Normal, how long have you been with the Dude? So how long has this relationship gone on?
Well, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I appreciate being a part of this. For me, it's been something that's been part of my professional career is, with Dude Solutions in some form, be it School Dude or the Facility Dude platform. Gosh, probably early 2000, 2001, or even late 90s. So. Yeah. And that's what triggered my mind when Earl kind of mentioned your background from the school side. And I think that's why I'm really glad you're going to give us some insight today is you're coming from the perspective of when we talk about public sector guide to energy management, you've got the experience from both educational facilities as well as municipal facilities. So I'm excited to dive in today. So with that said, everyone on the call, thank you for joining us. I want to go over kind of a brief agenda of what we're going to talk about today. I think really we want to keep this a conversation, Mark and I, kind of podcast style, honestly, of just some Q&A, some back and forth, some real world ideas. Obviously give you a chance on the call to ask questions as well towards the end. So we really want this to be interactive as much as possible. But this is a kind of an overview of what we're going to talk about. Obviously, we're going to hit the high points. What's the current state of energy and utilities management? So, why we're here,
We're going to look at kind of that middle chunk, the steps for success. This is the bulk of what we want you to walk away with. So as Mark and I are talking and we're giving ideas, one of the things Mark's really great at is just practical advice. So kind of the middle portion here of just steps for success. This is going to be a guide, as the title will suggest, or a plan, steps 1 through 5 that you can do, walk away with some action items when we talk about sustainability and conservation in our facilities. We'll give a brief shout out to how Dude can come alongside you and help, and then wrap up with the Q&A. So why are we here today? Let's jump in. Some of you may have seen this quote in one form or fashion or another, but there's a need, right? When we talk about energy in our utility line item, if you will, our annual budgets, it's typically the second or third largest cost for public sector organizations. And interestingly enough, we find that it's the budget line item that's rarely managed to a deep level. So you've got, your assets and your operations, and you track with work order systems. You've got your people and your HR functions, and you've got accounting software, and then you've got energy, and you've got a spreadsheet, or you download utility bills offline to try to get an idea. But this is kind of the state that we're in. And Mark, I wondered, you and I were kind of briefly discussing this slide when we put things together, but this kind of triggered something in your brain. So I kind of wanted to get some feedback from you. How does this relate when you think about your career and just this reality?
Yeah, I think you're spot on with, rarely tracking, probably very much reality for folks. And in my experience, it was difficult to track because I think in different organizations that have the potential for silos in different departments or different, in public sector, accounting is very much a line item and division, and inherently these things get carved up. Coming to the town or looking back in previous employments, what reality I think often occurs is that you have people who aren't necessarily trained, are just processing for payment utility invoices, and not one person in particular sees them to be able to see trends. So I think that just inherently is kind of common, or I would guess is common to most municipalities or other public sectors.
Yeah, and that you hit on a really key point. It's something we'll talk about. It's just the idea that there may not be the expertise, and that's not a slight on anyone in particular. It's just your job is not to find trends. Perhaps it's really just to process payments, and so just the idea that energy has this, or there's this understanding or this perception that it's a fixed cost. So I'm just going to pay the bill, I'm going to move on, and I'm going to assume the bill is right. What's interesting about that, and I'm glad you mentioned it, is, according to Energy Star, and most of us are familiar with EPA and the Energy Star program, 30% of energy in typical commercial buildings are wasted. So if you think about that big line item, right, a third of that is waste. Because we don't really dive into the trends, or don't even know how to dive into the trends. And so,
can I jump in there on that one, Dan? I think that's a stat. From my experience, like, okay, what does that mean? What 30% is wasted? Okay, well, what does that even look like? How do I track down that 30% or even identify what it is? And I think from my perspective, it's having, like you said, having the tools and trends, one, to see peaks and valleys. Now, if you aren't able to see those trends, which means you got to get all your information together and have a way to collect data and then get it in front of you in a very simple and concise format. So you may not be able to tell what that 30% is, but you might be able to say, I need to ask a question to figure out what that is, or do I have a behavior problem or an equipment problem? If you can't see that, you don't know what that 30% represents, and it could be as wild as, you know, people's imaginations. So that is something there for you.
No, that's perfect. I think you're exactly right. Because it hits on what we're going to talk about as we kind of move forward is that there are a lot of things that you can do in your facilities under the scope of conservation. I mean, there's, like you said, there's people, behavioral change, there's capital improvements, and kind of everything that falls under those two buckets. But a good starting place is just knowing that there's waste happening and where it's happening, right? And that's going to lead you to asking more questions. If I know that City Hall is wasting more than Fire Station 3, that gives me the place, well, I know I need to start asking questions about operations at City Hall. Or, you know, if high school number 1 is more of an outlier than high school number 2, right? I may not know what it is yet, but like you said, I can start asking deeper questions about these facilities. So it's a great point, and it really, as we progress forward, that's the reality. Whether we're talking behavior changes, whether we're talking capital improvement or operational changes, there is opportunity. In the 5 to 10% range, studies show there's opportunity when we even attack things like the little to no cost options first. And so that's where I think just kind of setting the stage here, this is an obvious reality. Your utility costs are not fixed. They can be influenced, they can be reduced. And the biggest question, kind of like you just mentioned, Mark, is how. There's so many different ways to go about finding these savings. So that's what we want to leave today. If there is a slide that I would say you guys screenshot on the call or write down anything, this is the one slide that I would say, take a mental image or an actual image of. Because what Mark and I want you to walk away with is the knowledge that you can have a plan, whether it be something super basic or whether it be something a little bit more complex, right? Whether your organization has a sustainability council or a green team, or whether you're the Lone Ranger, we want to give you kind of a step 1 through 5 process of what you can do and where you can start. So with that being said, let's dive into the meat of this, and Mark and I are going to continue to dialogue back and forth, and we're going to lean on Mark from some of his experience and expertise in both the K through 12 and the municipal sector. So another way to summarize the APEM, the APPEM is, can you answer these questions? Where are we at today? Where do we need to act, or where can we act? And then where are we going, so that I can make this process cyclical? So when we start off, and Mark, you touched on this, so I'm going to ask you to give some feedback as well. But you hit on a really great point. Step 1, where are we at today? When properly managing your facilities or properly tracking data, there's a couple of things you want to be able to do, or that you need to be able to do at minimum to start off. And they are making sure your bills are correct, even making sure that you can track your bills in a central place, understand where the dollars are being wasted, and then identify trends and plans for the future. So, Mark, what are some things just kind of in these 3 buckets here when you think of answering these questions? Are you paying the right amount of money on your bills? Where are your dollars being spent or wasted, and identifying trends? What are some things that you look for from a data perspective as kind of your initial, if you were starting fresh at a new organization and you wanted to kind of get a feel for where things are at, what are some of the first things that you'll do in a building?
Well, I would probably look at the portfolio of meters across the organization, make sure I had all the accounts. Just check and make sure everything drives, maybe do a little audit on, what the utility companies have versus what we have. And, when I first got to the town of Normal, what that looked like was we spent some time in pickup trucks and we ran around town verifying meters. And we cleaned up some stuff just through that practical effort. And that's not fun, and it may not be necessary for everybody. But, it's one thing to kind of, validate and have a two-way accountability on that. And talking about utilities in, the sense of a fixed cost, it's almost as if it's just like one of those necessary evils of life, kind of like, taxes and death. You're going to have utility bills. and not only the fact that they're coming, but people have, this sense that if you don't pay them on time, you need to be expeditious with it because there's either going to be late fees or the lights are going to go off, and you don't want to be the one that's responsible for City Hall getting shut down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's some inherent pressure that I think gets confused. Important gets confused with urgent, and I think that's one thing to separate. So anyway, circling back just to the fundamentals is getting all your bills coming to one place or one person that can collect the data. And what we do here at the town is we process the bills for everybody, but we don't own everybody's account. So we just say these are approved for payment, and then the payment hits each person's account, and they have, they can see whatever's coming or getting paid out of those. We provide trends and things of that nature because we're able to collect it and see it. Things of that.
So where? Well, and I don't mean to cut you off, but you hit on something, Mark. How big of a deal was it? And maybe that's the wrong phrasing, but what you're describing is not unique in the sense that obviously the facilities department is not responsible for paying every department's budget, but you do centralize the data, right? So what did that do in terms of just insight into kind of answering this question of where our dollars are going, or taking a snapshot of the municipality's utility cost? Even though you don't manage everybody's budget, you still centralize the data. What did that do for the town once that process was solidified and it came to a central place?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I'll give you two examples. One, organizationally and from a process standpoint, when we started making that transition, so from an efficiency standpoint, we went from probably 15 to 20 people processing utility bills of various sorts down to 3 once we started collecting it. And
wow.
We would analyze it, we'd organize it, we'd tie it to the account code, and then we'd send it over to finance and they'd process it. So, we're not responsible for each person's budget, or each department's budget, but we have an influence to it because we have the data. So that lends itself to, credibility because it's concise, it's accurate, and we have become part of the budget process with finance to set organizationally the individual line items for each department's budget pertaining to utilities. Now, that, has its advantages for the department as well as the organization in efficiency and accuracy. But one real life example is what it allowed us to do is get an intimate understanding and almost a relationship, as odd as that sounds, with our utility bills. Yeah. When you're in them, you get to know them, and we happen to have one utility bill. So we master bill everything, so it all comes in one, aggregated bill. And we got a bill one year for almost $750,000, and immediately we knew that was wrong just by looking at it because it was about twice as much as what a typical month bill would be for us. What that triggered was nearly a two-year effort where we paid maybe 2 bills until we had the issue resolved, and it was all on the provider's billing side. But because we were able to look at that data, manage it, compare, we were able to hold our ground, and they ultimately resolved it, and we ended up getting credited back several $1,000s because we were actually providing the accountability piece back to them before we'd allow them to receive any payment.
Yep. And it's such a good case study. I think that story or that case study can be duplicated across a lot of the folks on the call at some form or fashion or another. The idea being that our utility providers are not perfect, and I don't think they pretend to be. Mistakes are made, and it's just a part of life. But a large chunk, let's say 1%, even maybe 1.5% of your savings, when we talk about conservation and energy management, they may just be financial savings, meaning you're not doing something to reduce usage in your buildings that then relate to cost. It may just be cost savings because you're being able to audit your bills. And so I think that's a good step one, and that's why we start. Where are we at? Taking that snapshot of understanding current consumption, understanding your utility rates, understanding your bills, in order to find those savings. So I just think it's a great point, and it lends itself to, as much as you on the call can centralize your data. Again, just like Mark, whether you pay the total budget for your organization or whether other departments manage it, being able to have central data is gonna save time, essentially gonna save cost as well. So,
man, can I
other ways to? Oh yeah, absolutely.
Just one other thought that occurred to me for those of us that work in or have experience with different divisions, and some of that becomes kind of territorial in different organizations and different divisions. So silos become quite a problem for people who have organizational perspectives. And what I would offer was, it doesn't matter necessarily who owns it, as long as, like you were saying, to your point about getting centralized data. Like with this energy manager piece we use, there's multiple users, and anybody, if you had 17 divisions, as long as they were putting the same information in, it was going to the same place, and whoever ultimately is responsible for picking the trends out can do that, it's still mission accomplished.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There's so many reasons why having central data is good, and we can share some of those, some further, examples of that. But you're right, and I think this first step, right, when we think back to that slide earlier of the steps that we're talking about, this assessment phase, it's a critical piece. It's a critical piece just to be able to understand at any time what is the current situation. Whether I have to put boots on the ground or whether I can look at data, I need to know what I'm spending. I need to know where I'm spending it as a step one. So auditing your bills, like Mark said, some other areas, other ways to address kind of the snapshot of where you're at today, just if you're taking notes on the call, performing an energy audit. I'm going to have some questions for Mark towards the end on this specific piece. Of things that you can look for in your buildings, or even things like Mark talked about, making sure, like a meter audit, making sure that the meters that you think you're paying are the ones that the utilities are billing you for. So when we talk about other ways to address energy consumption, we'll talk about an audit a little later on. But performing an audit, that can be done simply as a person walking through the buildings themselves, or that can be done professionally. So there are varying levels of that. And another way to address energy consumption is just, this should say setting, maybe instead of forgetting, it might have been a typo, but setting your baseline. So understanding if that's the year 2015, if that's the year 2008, 2010, you really want a year to compare against. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So I'm going to get past the energy audit piece because I know we're going to talk about it a little later on. But the idea is just to provide an in-depth picture of building performance and have information to help you do something about it. The next stage, guys, we've talked about kind of step one, assessing where you're at today. The next two steps, prioritize and plan. And they're helping you understand where can we act. So obviously the biggest deliverable of the assessment phase is being able to see in the data where's the outlier. And that may be a facility, it may be a piece of equipment, right? But you're trying to understand, because I've got my central data, just like Mark was saying, he can provide trends to his different departments, kind of provide some guidance. Because he can assess the data, he can then say, hey, fire chief, or hey, principal, it looks like your building is the outlier. So what are some things that we can do? Let's collaborate together to understand, does it need to be people changes? Something as simple as making sure lights are turned off or making sure space heaters are not brought in. Does it need to be capital improvements? Hey, we've had a boiler that's just causing us a lot of maintenance issues. It's toward the end of its useful life. We need to consider a capital replacement. Whatever it may be, the where can we act phase, prioritizing and planning is what goes on in this phase. I really like this slide, and I'm gonna talk about it a little bit more. But the reason I show this, and the reason I think it's a helpful visual is if we're talking about capital planning or equipment replacement or renovations or retro commissioning, it should be more than just gut feel. It should be more than PR driven. It should really look at data. When we talk about replacing equipment or LED lighting retrofits, we should be able to look at, is this going to have not just a maintenance payback, i.e., hey, I spent a lot of time, working on this boiler or working on this HVAC system. I spent a lot of time changing bulbs or ballasts. We should also look at the efficiency or the energy side as well to be able to say, hey, this mechanical piece of equipment, it's saying it's got 5 years of life left. But do I want to spend 5 more years of high energy costs, in this facility because of this aging piece of equipment? So my question to you, Mark, would be, knowing there's kind of two buckets when we talk about prioritizing and planning where to act. Obviously, we can talk about some of the behavioral things, but if we're talking about the capital component, equipment changes and projects, what are some of the things that you look for, and what are indicators to you that we may need to take a deeper look in terms of equipment replacements or retrofits?
Yeah. So that's a very, very variable and as predictable as you want to be. The equipment tends to decide for itself.
Okay.
So to your point, you have to consider these things for the life cycles that are, maybe industry best practice or standard. If you get, say, 15 years out of a piece of HVAC equipment, that's all well and good, but it could die in year 2 and you have to replace it. And then if you've got the active and progressive PM, you could get 20 years out of it.
Yeah.
I think, again, it's a very dynamic, any kind of facilities management, especially with capital planning, beyond equipment life and trying to keep it going, and the factors that, to answer your question specifically, are, of course, cost of operation, cost of maintenance, failure rates. I'd say the criticality of the equipment for the area it serves, what's the tolerance for failure. In some cases, you can run to fail, and that's perfectly appropriate. And in other cases, there's a zero tolerance. like in our fire stations, those are unique buildings. Beyond the fact that it's a public safety service, it's a residence. Guys or people live there. So HVAC is, it's just kind of one of those things that's going to take priority. So that, as opposed to maybe a cabinet unit ventilator at a parking deck, is going to have it's just going to have a different priority. So,
right.
And I would add too that the piece that I think gets neglected oftentimes is how function can change, or the demand of a space can change, and that can influence your capital plan wildly.
Absolutely. And all of this goes into your thinking when you're sitting down with data, or you're sitting down with your team at the beginning of the year, and you're trying to prioritize and plan where you should act. I think you gave great examples. Just the sheer scope of opportunity, there's a lot of thought that goes into it. And I'm glad you responded in the way you did. I thought that you would. In my mind, it solidifies why you have a job, and why you you guys and gals on the call have a job. Technology is great, and it can help us do a lot of things, but there's still a people component involved in being able to make some of these decisions. And I think that's kind of highlighted on this slide. These are some questions that you can begin to ask. And I think that Mark talked a little bit about some of those, is to help us make sure that our energy management and our sustainability goals and initiatives progress forward. There's some common sense things that we want to do, right? And that may be what projects are just going to give us the quickest payback and are going to be the easiest to implement. And it may be lighting retrofits. I mean, those are the most common, I guess I would call it low-hanging fruit. It's just kind of a no-brainer payback. Lower wattage bulbs are going to save money. That may be what we want to look across our portfolio and see, where are we still using the T8s and the T12s, and where can we replace this? Is that going to get the most buy-in from council, or is that going to be the best outcome? What I mean by this slide is, let's use some practicality and some common sense when we think about capital projects, and try to get some quick wins first. And so, Mark, I'm actually curious to hear about, have there been some projects in the past that you knew were going to be no-brainers that did get some really quick buy-in from council and they had a good outcome, and what were some of those, if that's the case?
Yeah, absolutely. And it happens on various scales, but I think one project that represents kind of the full picture, we did a lighting retrofit. Like you said, it's kind of going out cherry picking projects, but we had T12s actually, the old 8-footers, and we swapped them out with LEDs. In Illinois here, we have an incentive program that everybody pays into through the utility bills. And that's another one. If folks aren't taking advantage of the incentives that are out there, it's your money. And it's just, are you going to let somebody else spend it, or are you going to try and get a cut of it? So I would encourage to be looking for incentives, at least in Illinois and Ameren territory. But yeah, so we did this through an incentive program, a local contractor. They did the calculations and, showed a reduction in our consumption, and then a reduction, of course, in the cost. The payback, I think they projected, was 4 months. We saw it in 2.
Wow.
With the incentive, I think our total out of pocket cost was $500. And it was a smaller project, but I think it was $10,000 overall. But the interesting thing to me with that was, so that was December of 2018, and I just went back through here and did the verification of their projections, because I'm of the mindset where I also have Excel, and I can make spreadsheets say whatever I want them to. And if I never verify it, well, then we'll just consider that a success, kind of thing. So having these tools to be able to input this data and these projections and then track it, what we found out was they're actually wrong on the consumption. It did not perform as well as anticipated. However, because of the electrical rate that we had versus their assumption there, we actually exceeded the actual savings. Mm-hmm. So being able to tell that full story and understand that that's the reality of it, and there are some risks in the assumptions going forward, I don't know how else you get to that easily without being able to document that, verify it, and then tell that story, and tell that story for the reality of what it is, so that as you move forward, it is what it is. And then you can talk about things like, is consumption our biggest concern? Is cost our biggest concern? Of these energy projects that we're doing, how much of it is the global climate impact worth? Do we care about that? And how does that tie in? So there's a whole host of things there that are very big picture that come out of these boots on the ground, somebody out there putting lights up kind of projects. And it does have a global influence if that's part of the story. But the reality is in the daily grind, a lot of these decisions are just inherent to world-class operations that just, you see a light out and it's an incandescent, you're not going to replace it with the same thing. You're going to use the best technology that's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on something that we're going to specifically talk about in a couple more slides, and that's really kind of the next phase of when we execute our projects, and then when we kind of maintain this loop of assessing, prioritizing, and planning, and then maintaining again. One of the most critical components of post-project is the measurement and verification side. And that can be very simple, spreadsheet driven. That can be have a consultant come in and install some hardware and track the actuals, right? It can vary. But what I have found, at least in consulting with a lot of our clients, is that's the missing component to maintaining momentum in your program. If you're not reporting on project outcome, it's exactly like you said. Well, I'm just going to assume it's a success. Well, it may not have been, or it may have been even wildly more successful than the projections. Now I need to think about where I can duplicate this thing. But we would never know if we didn't track. And so I want to talk about that more in a couple more slides, because I think you're spot on. But again, in this phase, the prioritizing and planning phase, these are some questions we want to leave you with. There's a lot of questions that you can ask, but we want to leave you all on the call with some directives. One of the things gaining buy-in, this is something that it came out of a study from ExxonMobil. They've got kind of a world-renowned energy management program. Now, yes, they're in the oil and gas industry, but the idea remains the same. Buy-in from council, board, or administration is key. And what I mean by that is conservation, sure, is kind of a buzzword. You have folks that are really kind of aware of the cultural component to conservation and the social impact. You got folks that are really just looking to save a dollar in their organizations. I think both of those are fine. But when there's something as simple as a memo from council or an initiative from a board, your boards of educations, or even your city manager's office, to just say, hey, we can kind of redefine this as the years go on, but we are a green community, or we're a green organization. We care about this. It has a ripple effect on down through the ranks. And so I'm actually curious, Mark, from your experience, has there been anything from council, and this may be even, in your previous roles with the school district, was there any type of kind of top-down initiative that says we care about this, that had an impact? Oh, absolutely. So Town of Normal, it's an inherent, it's culture here. There's no, that's one of the greatest advantages I have professionally for, trying to
cooperate and support any kind of environmental management system of any sort is that it's an expectation here. So the challenge that I find, quite honestly, like you mentioned, being kind of a more practical approach kind of guy, is what does that mean? So there's a million initiatives, there's a million ideas out there, and there's not, I mean, I'm sure there's folks that had differing opinions, but by and large, I think sustainability and energy management and all those things are moving forward. They're globally important, and the holdbacks will probably be pulled along whether they like it or not at some point. So again, being in a role where it's like, okay, you know, I understand that we can locally have a global impact if we understand what we're all after. So that's the first challenge is, okay, you know, if you work in a culture like I do, where it's an expectation, you have a leg up in that you really don't have to try and get the buy-in. You have to meet the expectation of the buy-in, but the challenge becomes, what's the expectation? So do we understand what it takes to do, you know, 50% reduction in whatever by the year 20 whatever? What's it going to take? Do we even have the real estate to accomplish it? Is it a percentage? Is it you know, what is it? So, you know, those kind of challenges, I think, separate being able to make an impact from a practical standpoint. Like, how do you do it? How do you do it?
Yeah.
Are you going after the gravy projects like the lighting? And do they yield the results? So I think there needs to be a connection between policy and some kind of a project guideline so that the supervisors who are actually executing projects can hire people to do them.
Mm-hmm. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, we talked to midpoint last year on the policy side of things. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the town is kind of following along with some ISO standards, if I remember correctly. Am I wrong there?
Yeah. So we've aligned with ISO, and then our department has recently achieved the SIMS GB, which is the green building certification for ISSA on our custodial side, which lines up, of course, with everything in the community's culture, sustainability here. And I believe the town achieved that as the second municipality in the nation. I think Minnesota or Minneapolis was the other.
Okay. The reason I bring that up to everyone on the call, I don't think that we're suggesting that you recreate the wheel or have to hire, you know, a consulting firm to come in and help you, you know, create policy from scratch. I think there's already some tried and true guidelines that you mentioned, the Green Building Initiative. There's some ISO standards. There's ASHRAE standards. There's already been a lot of work done in just the industry that I think organizations can piggyback off of. So I say that to say, don't feel like you've got to recreate the wheel, but it's very important, like Mark mentioned, what are table stakes? You know, do we have a goal, and do we have guideline and policy to support that goal, and what kind of aligns with the culture of your organization? So it's a really good point. Moving forward, just I want to give us plenty of time for Q&A here, so I'm going to go through these next few slides pretty quickly, but just kind of wrapping up this middle tier. So we have looked at step one, assessing where you're at today, right? We've talked about the value of centralized data. We're just wrapping up now talking about kind of the middle chunk of using that data to help prioritize and plan, as you see on the screen here, different options to get funding for projects. It's really identifying the action part of your energy strategy. And that moves us into the doing, right? Where are we going? What are we going to do? We've assessed the data. We know where to act, and now we're going to do it. And I think the key point, and this is where I'm going to kind of highlight back to your statement, Mark, when we implement a project, when we do something, the key deliverable that I think that a lot of folks are missing is report on the doing, right? So if we do a lighting retrofit, if we install solar, if we purchase a certain amount of clean power from our utility provider, if we do mechanical upgrades, report on the doing, right? And that may be dashboards that are providing transparency of, pre and post project. It may be a spreadsheet that you keep off to the side, like Mark was talking about. It may be something where you've got an engineer come through and, professionally verify project savings. But the key piece to this last kind of phase of this plan is whatever you do, report on what you've done. Because the transparency helps you kind of start the cycle all over again and say, hey, that project was a bust or that project was a wild success. Now, how do we assess again where we're at today? So we've talked about a lot of the slides here that are kind of coming up. So I'm not gonna hover over them. I'm not gonna provide too much more color here. Because I want to get to some Q&A with Mark. So let me do a quick introduction on where Dude Solutions can help, and then let's open up, Earl on our end, let's open up the line and let's take some questions. So kind of putting this all together, where Dude Solutions can help. We've been in the space for quite some time. Like Mark mentioned, he's been a Dude client for close to 20 years now on the school side, and then now on the municipal government side. The reason we show this slide is not a brag. It's to say we interact with your peers on a daily basis. So even this webinar, leveraging Mark's expertise, Mark being your peer, right? We want to provide you value in terms of let's kind of connect some dots for you. If you've got questions on energy management, let's pull in a Mark and let's be able to say, hey, Mark is a part of this $2 billion energy consumption that's been tracked. What are some things that he's had success with? What are some things that he's learned through failure all across the board? And so when we relate that to our suite of products, everything from asset management, your work order systems, your asset life cycles, your capital planning, to energy management, like we're talking today, centralizing data, reporting on where you can act, measuring the success of projects on the back end, to how you schedule your facilities into IT products as well. So I'm going to hover over this kind of slide in terms of what's included. We can answer any more questions for you on the call offline about what's included, but cloud-based products, you're always using the latest version of the system. I think Mark's a great resource just over the years, all the improvements and the add-ons that have come with just his life as a client, mobile access, mobile technology, and then, of course, our training and support on the back end. So a poll question, and we're opening this up now on the back end. So we're just going to leave this live for a few seconds. If you would like any more information on any of the products or any of the things that we've talked about, we'll leave this up for a minute, and then we'll take Q&A.
Yep. That sounds good, Dan. Thank you and Mark for taking us through all that really, really awesome stuff. Greatly appreciate y'all's time and expertise walking us through that. Like Dan mentioned, the poll is live. Dan briefly kind of went over this, but we do a lot of different things with the Dude. The main thing we talked about today was controlling utility costs and saving energy and some best practices around that. But we do more with that, with helping streamline workflow and managing assets, capital forecasting, and even helping with events as well. So if any of that is intriguing to you and you'd like more information, we'll leave that poll up. But we are going to transition over to the Q&A now. And the first question we'll tee up for Dan that came in. Dan, what are some good indicators that an energy management plan will be successful?
Yeah, that's a good question. Before I answer that, to the person who wrote in a chat, we're going to address that question next as well. But to answer the question, just a good indicator, I think what Mark talked about is probably the number one indicator would be, is it culture, right? Do you have council or leadership support? And that doesn't have to be we've spent, $1 million on a huge climate action plan. We brought in consultants, we've done greenhouse gas inventories. Those are part of it, sure. It could just be, hey, this is something that's important, and we're going to start figuring out how important that is and what are some specific things we can do. So I do think the council buy-in and kind of the top-down support is a really good indicator.
Could I add to that too, Dan, if you don't mind?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think a lot of that, from my experience, is self-prescribed. Like, it's got to start from somewhere. Otherwise, you end up with this, I don't know, you can't get a tiger by the tail thing where there's so many objectives out there that you really need to if you're just getting started, you really need to dial them in on a local and even location-based to see what works. So an energy management plan can be any size, any shape, with any goals. It just has to fit the organization. Otherwise, it'll die on the vine or become unmanageable.
Right. Mark, we've got a question that's come in through the Q&A section, and if anybody wants to type through there, feel free. But this is where we're going to take the Q&A. Mark, it's a two-part question that I want to direct to you first. I can add some color later. It says go more into what you mean by trends and how specifically you're using that information. So that's the first part. And the second part would be, what are some examples of how you're tracking data and reporting the results to users in the organization? So what do you mean by trend, and then some examples of tracking data and reporting the results? Okay,
so, I'll answer by, empirical, I guess, how we use it. So a trend to me might look like just, year over year maybe for total consumption. We don't sub-meter everything. We're just not there. And, we would like to get there someday, but frankly, without the trends and the, what's the word I want? Maybe credibility of the trends to influence, it takes an investment to get down to that level. And frankly, I don't know that it's always worth it. So you kind of have to, self-evaluate and determine, at what level you need to be digging down in. I am very prone to wanting, if I can get 30 pieces of information, I'll take all 30. And the reality is I might use 2 over my lifetime. So there's a little bit of humility in the data because there's a ton of it. And that's where we start. So we trend high-level stuff, and for an example would be what is the year over year at maybe the golf course or something of that nature here. Pick a building. And then we would look for trends, meaning is it running high in July versus last year? And if so, we would push that out to the department by question and just say, are you guys doing anything different? Did you add staff or did you add hours? How can we explain this? And if they say no, then we go out in the field and see if we've got something that's running all the time. And maybe a schedule flipped or something of that nature. It's really that practical. And another example of that would be tracking data. So we had here locally a big fish kill in some of our ponds. So we added, EPA was out and, it was nothing it was just one of those act of God kind of things, but the recommendation was to add aerators to our detention ponds. So we did that. Well, now all of a sudden we've got these costs mid-year in the budget. So we just pulled the trend for all the new aerators and, I got it sitting in front of me here and so we need to influence the budget going into next year, and we also are making the the department aware of that cost increase to their line item and their operations, so they know the significance of the equipment, not because in facilities world, usually the cheapest piece of anything is building it. And after that, it gets expensive, whether you start maintaining it or trying to, putting people inside of it. That's when the real costs come. So that's how, that's how we use it.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. I wouldn't add too much more to that. I think those are good real world examples. When I think of trends, I think you hit on probably the key one is just year over year, whether I'm doing this manually or whether I've got a piece of software to help me, I want to be able to look at, February 2020 usage and cost in my right hand, and then be able to look at February 2019, 2018, 2017, whatever in my left hand, and understand over those past, 2, 3, 4 years, am I trending upwards, meaning I'm spending more and more, using more and more each year? Or am I trending downwards? And like you said, whatever the answer may be, I can dive in to see, is it because schedules have flipped? Is it because a piece of equipment is running? Is it because of the weather? And that's the answer that it stops right there, right? It was just a hotter summer.
Right. And, to that point, Dan, before I lose the thought, I'm sorry to cut you off, is that's the value of the software piece. A spreadsheet won't normalize your data for you. And the other piece is consumption is I think more stable of an indicator on a trend than cost. Right,
exactly. Because cost can be rate increases, across the board, and that your consumption stays the same, but your costs have gone up. Any other questions, Earl? I don't know if you've got any on your end that I can't see.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we're 3 minutes from the top of the hour, so I think we'll tackle one last one and then go ahead and close it down. This is kind of just a general question for both of you guys, but we'll tee it up to Mark first. Mark, what have you guys seen historically be your biggest challenge in good energy management? And then what recommendations do you have just on kind of how to overcome that challenge?
Yeah, that's kind of a big question. I think all of it's a challenge, but it's also all a choice. And I think to be a little bit philosophical, I think you have to understand what your objectives are so that you can make choices to achieve them. And then to get the buy-in, you have to present the choices you want to make to get marching orders. So that can be a challenge. Once you know that, though, or even if you don't have buy-in, you're folks at some level are going to have the responsibility to choose to maintain facilities or manage energy, whether it's active or passive. Somebody's going to be on the hook for it. So that being said, it's kind of irrelevant in having, I don't want to say irrelevant. It's easier if you have buy-in, but it doesn't change the fact that if you have resources, you need to deploy them, I guess, for energy conservation, and that includes you talked about it, Dan. I think you mentioned it. All the different pieces. There's not a piece of this that doesn't. It's just like a very intricate machine, almost like a watch, where every gear touches something else. So energy management, it's going to affect your mechanicals, and your mechanicals affect your energy, and your work orders are going to somehow influence that, and your preventative maintenance piece is going to influence that. So the challenge is, I think, it's not terribly concise, but the challenge is to make sure all the gears are hitting and working for the same outcome. And somebody's got to kind of decide what those are and then have a system in place so that it all comes together.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually wouldn't add anything to that. I think that's a perfect perfect answer. I will throw this slide up on the screen just kind of right here as we close. Again, if we can leave you with anything today, we've heard a lot of good real world examples from Mark. But if we could leave you anything today, I think having a plan in place, whether it's simple or complex, this is the plan we want to leave you with to kind of guide how you move forward. So Earl, I'll let you wrap us up.
Yeah, absolutely. Gentlemen, appreciate you both so much and taking us through everything. We are at 3 o'clock. Thank you to all of those who attended today and stuck with us all the way through the Q&A. We appreciate it. Plenty of great follow-ups for you guys all to take away with you today. Again, greatly appreciate it. Mark, Dan, thank you guys so much. And we will have plenty more webinars in the future, and look forward to seeing you guys rejoin us for those future ones. But everybody take care, and we'll see you next time.